so thank you everyone for being here. So I'm Kornelia, I'm an assistant professor of finance. And this panel will hopefully bring many things together that you've already heard about today. We will, let me first introduce my panelists. So I will start with Jane. So Jane Firth is Head of Responsible Investment at Border to Coast Pensions Partnership. Welcome. Then we have Marion Maloney, who is Head of Responsible Investment and Governance at Environmental Agency Pension Fund. Next, we have Hans-Christoph Hirt, who is former Head of EOS at Federated Hermes. Then we have Paul Lee from Redington and Peter Reilly from FTI Consulting. So welcome, everyone. And let me first guide you a bit of about what you will hear about. So first, every panelist will speak about what they do and what is close to their heart with respect to stewardship, accountability, and reporting. And then we will move on to some questions. So we had some discussions before this panel about how to make it most interesting. So we will speak about the conflict or the let's say the dilemma of what to do when you have some situation where you're not sure if to divest or to engage, and accountability. In this context, then we will speak about objectives in terms of maximizing shareholder value versus pursuing other goals. Next, I would like to briefly touch on governance and accountability. Because I think there is quite a bit for them to do, because let's say, I mean, it's a textbook definition. Pollution is a negative externality, and it's a definition. I mean, it's a market failure, but somehow the market is trying to self-regulate on this. And then we will speak about reporting, net zero pledges, and so on, which will nicely link to the panel that will follow today. All right, so let me start. Let's start from Jane, and then we will continue one by one. Tell us about yourself and what is close to your heart in this context.
Is that better? Yeah. Hi, and it's really good to be here, and thanks ever so much for asking me to be part of this panel. Yeah, I'm Head of Responsible Investment at Border to Coast Pensions Partnership, which is one of the local government pension pools that was set up in 2018 to facilitate. I think the mic is working. Not working. No. I'll try again. Yes. Technology's never been my strong point. Yeah, I'm Head of Responsible Investment at Border to Coast Pensions Partnership, which was set up in 2018 to facilitate the pooling of local government pension scheme assets. So we've got 12 partner funds. That's what we call them. There are 11 local government pension schemes, and in total they've got assets under management of around 55 billion sterling, and we have about 35 billion of that currently with us at Border to Coast. So we develop and set up investment funds and products for them to invest in and to implement their strategic asset allocation. So we're a bit of a hybrid. We're actually regulated by the FCA as an alternative investment manager, but we're seen in the wider industry as an asset owner because we're there representing our shareholders and our customers who are asset owners. So we also have a split between internally and externally managed assets. So we have an internal investment team that invests directly, actively. So I work with portfolio managers and research analysts, and they're investing in unlisted equity and fixed income. And we've also got an alternatives offering as well. But we've also got external managers. So managing products for us, unlisted equity, again, fixed income and multi-asset credit. I think Kerry mentioned earlier about governance, didn't she, and how it's important that it's important for asset owners, for institutions, asset managers to walk the talk as well, and to have strong governance. And we felt that was very much the case for us when we were setting up to be a sustainable long-term organisation. Excuse me, you've got to have good governance structures in place, but that doesn't mean they're static. We need to make sure that that's developing and evolving. And because for everything we do, our partner funds are at the heart of that. So, it's incredibly important that we have strong governance structures to support that. We can evidence that by the fact that we've got 2 non-exec members on our board who are elected members, and by elected members, I mean because our pension committees are made up of councillors, elected councillors. So we've got 2 elected councillors on the board of Border to Coast. So we're accountable to our customers, who are our shareholders. We're also accountable to wider stakeholders, so that's the beneficiaries, because those 11 LGPS funds have got over 1 million beneficiaries, either contributing to pension funds or deferred members or being paid pensions. So we're working on behalf of those members, making sure that they've got sustainable long-term pensions for the future. So we do that via a variety of means. So we report, we have meetings regularly with the officers of those funds, the officers operation group, and that's generally on investment, but specifically on responsible investment issues as well, to keep them informed and make sure that we're working closely together with them. There is also regular calls and meetings with the finance directors of the administering authorities, the pension committees, and the chief pension officers as well. And then we have another layer of governance as well. We have what's classed as our joint committee, and that's made up of the pension committee chairs of each of those 11 local government pension funds, and obviously our board sits at the top of everything else. We're also accountable to the regulators, obviously the FCA, the FRC, PRI as a signatory, and UK Stewardship Code, we're a signatory of that as well. And that also helps demonstrate to all our stakeholders what we're doing on their behalf on responsible investment and stewardship. And then just quickly on the external manager aspect of this as well, we're obviously accountable to our partner funds across all the investments that we manage on their behalf, but our external managers are also accountable to us, and we built that in through the selection, appointment and ongoing monitoring phase of any external managers that we appoint. We're obviously conscious that there is a lot of greenwashing out there, and it's built into our invitation to tender, so that initial point when managers are applying to manage a portfolio or a product on our behalf. And I think I'm still quite surprised. I mean, we've got a tender out at the moment for an emerging market manager, but I've not seen any of the responses yet. But I'm still astounded by the quality or lack of quality on some of the responses that you get, that there is no joined up approach, that people think they can fill in the RI section and nobody will look to see whether that's actually joined up to what they're doing on portfolio construction or the business strategy and philosophy. But, we do look. I don't just focus on the RI section, I look at the whole ITT when it comes in. It's also part of that ongoing monitoring, as part of that selection as well, we then as an RI team hold separate RI interviews with a shortlisted manager. So we send out a much more detailed questionnaire, because that's important to lift up all those other stones that are not being answered in the ITT. And then that ongoing quarterly and annual monitoring, which is key to seeing whether managers are actually doing what they say. It's looking at ESG integration, portfolio construction, how they're engaging, and I know that that's something that we're going to come on later, so I'll not spoil that. But voting as well, and even though we vote all our mandates. We don't expect our external managers don't do it. I think it's still crucial that we look at what they're doing on key votes and whether that's aligned with our process and approach or not. And if not, then we will challenge them. I think that's probably. I'm conscious I don't want to get scowls from. So I'll leave it there because I think everything else will probably get picked up in the questions.
Thank you. So I'm Paul Lee. I work at a firm called Redington, which is one of those evil investment consultants that Leanne mentioned earlier on, which are terribly influential but influential in apparently all the wrong ways. So we compete with Willis Towers Watson and Aon Hewitt and Mercer. Those are the three big players. They're much bigger than us. We're clearly much better than them. My personal background is I've been doing stewardship stuff for 20 years. I'm a former colleague of Hans's, actually a former colleague of a number of the people around the room. And it's nice to be back in that company. So why did I join Redington? Because I agree with Leanne that investment consultants can be really influential in ensuring the quality of accountability for stewardship activities. And at present, that is not being done terribly effectively. I think it was Emmett that talked earlier about asset owners not being good buyers of stewardship services. And that is clearly true because of the challenge of getting under the skin of what's actually being done in practice, whether that's effective, whether it's real or not. And I think, to my mind, the reason why there are problems in this space is all down to anecdotes. So we rely on the anecdote, the story about stewardship activity and the direction of travel and the way in which companies or other investments are changing under the influence of stewardship, because that's the only way to communicate it. And therefore the anecdote is the right way to do it, but it's also a very dangerous way to do it because you're picking, fund managers are tempted to pick their best story, which may or may not be the most material issue, the most material investment for the asset owner. So what am I trying to do at Redington is help our clients, who are big pension schemes, predominantly in the UK, to be better buyers of these services by helping them look through the anecdotes, helping them to press managers to get a little bit tougher and harder on themselves, and talking a little bit more about what's material, both in terms of the material holdings and the material issues at those holdings. Just one more point from me before passing the baton. Jane talked about the disconnect between what fund managers typically say and what they do. We run a survey every year of managers from around the world, and we publish a report on that over the summer, just highlighting what we've learned and what the issues are. And I think one of the most striking areas of disconnect between what managers say and do is on the diversity and inclusion set of questions. We ask managers, are your teams representative of the demographic of wherever you are operating? And almost all of them say yes. And it's quite surprising because that means that most fund managers operate in a place where the population is 75% male. I won't go into the ethnic mix, but it's as bad on that side as well. So there is a disconnect within the minds of some fund management organizations. They believe they're doing the right things and believe they are delivering in practice. Unfortunately, they're not, and we need to get we need to be able to look through that. I'll pass on. Thanks,
Bill. I'm Peter Reilly. I'm even worse. I'm a consultant for large public businesses and companies and private businesses. So not even on the investor side, but hopefully give a slightly differing perspective on the impact that stewardship activities have on a lot of our clients and the value that the investor pressure adds to business. I was formerly, before FDI, I joined FDI about 6 years ago, was with Glass Lewis, the proxy advisor for the same time, a colleague of Emmett, who you heard from earlier, and a couple in the audience. Yeah, listen, I suppose if you asked me 15 years ago, would it be corporate reporting that I dreamed of ending up in? Probably not. But since then, I've learned to love it, and genuinely see a sort of a huge value in it. And I think sort of come from the school of sunlight is the best disinfectant. And not just quantity, though. I think we've fallen into a bit of a trap around reporting, whereby, you know, the longer the annual report, the more values in it. There's a lot of branding, there's a lot of nice images, usually of diverse people, which might not reflect the actual business. But what we do with clients is genuinely try and bring a fresh perspective, kind of doing what Glass Lewis do around the AGM, but doing that 6 months ahead of time, 7 months ahead of time, and being at the board seat, and trying to push those key investor topics, those key stakeholder topics, when boards are making decisions, rather than, you know, sort of with 3 weeks ago to an AGM, trying to get as much disclosure out to explain things that never happened. And I think a lot of corporates fall into that trap. But I also think that the majority of them, and I'm not excusing all and saying that there's not bad actors out there, of course there are, but the majority of corporates fall into a trap of this area being a burden, and sort of come from a place where reporting was probably a legal requirement, a regulatory requirement, and saying nothing more than you're supposed to. My mother's a lawyer, so I'm not going to bash them too heavily, but there's definitely overly aggressive cutting of reporting, and boards fall into that trap. They do. Audit committees fall into the trap, and you end up with incomplete reporting. And I don't mean unfinished sentences, but not valuable ones. And that's a big issue. And it genuinely is. We sit at board meetings, we sit at committee meetings, whereby there are advisors around the table sort of pushing for less information. But there is a change of the guard. There is an understanding in most boards that, you know, stakeholders expect more information. I think investors have been successful in certain areas at pushing for that, at pushing the sort of stakeholder agenda. And I think there's more of an understanding now than ever that you have to speak to multiple audiences when you report. You have to be accountable to multiple audience. You know, are you speaking to your investors solely? No. You're speaking to employees, both prospective and current. You're speaking to your suppliers, you're speaking to your customers. And that is all inextricably linked to the bottom line ultimately. If you're in a business where you're shedding talent, how can you protect the prosperity of the business? If your supply chain is weak and vulnerable, you know, that's a huge risk. And so we are, I think, shifting probably slower than lots of people want to a greater understanding of those pressures and their impact on the financials. But there is, I would say, a long way to go. And where does the accountability lie, and to whom is still a question that the legal framework is fairly specific on it. And that's where boards, I think, are challenged to say, you know, what's my responsibility as a director? Where are my duties as a director? And the law's not, you know, I don't think the law and the market are aligned on it. And so you're hearing one thing from your investors, who you have a responsibility to, and one thing from the law. So I think, to sum up, I see a huge value in reporting, and it's linked to accountability, because you put something out there, you have to stand over it. And I think where the challenge lies is making sure that that reporting is of value rather than of length. And I think that's from a stewardship perspective, from investors reporting themselves, but also their investee companies.
Thank you. Hello. So I'm come from the Environment Agency Pension Fund. It represents 40,000 members, very green-minded members, generally have had a background in the public services. And so my members are tough. My members want us to act with ambition and urgency, in particular to address climate change. I know where they're coming from. My job is to manage their expectations. So let me introduce the Environmental Pension Fund. We've got about £5 billion worth of assets under management. About 20 years ago, we started on this journey, which we called responsible investment. And it was basically at the time based on reputational risk, which was primarily we were invested in oil and gas companies, and then our employer, the Environmental, was taking them to court because they were doing up to no good. Fast forward 20 years, oil and gas still dominate my members' thoughts. However, in between, we've known a lot more about climate change and the risks that it can present to our finances. So that's been an absolute driver for us for certainly the last 5 years. But over that period of 20 years, we've had this long period of shifting away from kind of passives into going into actives, going into sustainable actives. And we've had, quite a journey. And actually what we've come out with is, on the environmental side, something which is 5 years ahead in terms of getting us to net zero by 2045. But on the finance side, which I often have to defend at conferences, we are fully funded, defined benefit, open scheme. We've been fully funded for the last 6 years. We've got returns 1, 3, 5 years, which outperform the market. The idea that you have to take a hit on the green side is something that I always defend very, very heavily. You do not have to. Our fund has proved you do not have to. And we're not this little niche greeny fund. We're out there in the mainstream market, and we're out there subject to absolutely the same rules as everybody else. If I just do duty, if I go to my committee and say, hey, this is a fantastic opportunity, but it doesn't have the required risk return, then it won't get anywhere with my committee. So that's the background. I should also state I'm also a board member on the Transition Pathway Initiative. So if anybody out there wants to get nice, easy understanding of, how companies are aligning to a net zero world, then that gives very nice, free, publicly available information on that. I also co-led some work for the International Investors Group on climate change around resilience and adaptation. And on that, maybe this is my segue into the next bit, which is my very last comment in our Stewardship Code report was that we as a fund, we as a collective investor community, and indeed everybody, is not doing enough around adapting to climate change. So I'm just going to put it out there because that's a real issue that I think we all have. Anyway, so let's go back to the Stewardship Code, because actually I came in during the last debate and I thought it was really interesting. It was throwing up lots of issues that I wanted to engage with, but I just wanted to touch upon them from a fund perspective. First thing I'll say is I think the UK is so much further ahead than other countries on this. I'm invited to speak at a number of events, and actually I just think when I see representatives from other countries, I just think actually we are further down the line on that. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think we're further down the line. I really like the fact that the Stewardship Code, what we're asking to report on, is very holistic. You can't just talk about voting or shareholder resolutions. Us as a fund, responsible investment is absolutely part of every single committee discussion. It's part of our governance, it's part of our training program. It's right across the board. So that's another thing that I particularly like about the code. Also, I heard this morning around, well, actually, it's only relevant for certain asset classes. That's incorrect. I don't think that's right. If I look now at our fund, private markets, private equity, private debt, there's some really interesting initiatives going out there. We talked about greenwashing. Nobody in this room would go and buy a car and just buy the first car that they see. You've got to look under the bonnet. We had a meeting last week where we had, we sat down just with one asset manager, that's something we were particularly interested in, 2 hours discussing nothing but carbon and biodiversity. And now, and if that asset manager at the end of 2 years can give us confidence around that, then that's a great starting point. Obviously, it's not the only thing we look at. We have to look at the wider suite, but that is one thing. So that's on that. We have investment consultants we've had. I think investment consultants play a really important role to help funds on that. So I'm not going to say that they're the devil at all. Yeah, and the final thing I'll say about reporting. So, I spent the last 2 Easters literally writing my Stewardship Code report. I'm sure Jane's done exactly the same. My kids now equate chocolate Easter eggs with me being grumpy, sitting in my study saying, give me another hour. But it's been really important. Just before we did this, the summer before, we had a really massive consultation exercise with our members. And our members gave us the same challenge over and over again. How do we know you are making a difference? And so when the coach came along, I thought, do you know what? I'm going to tell them. I'm going to write this code for my members, tick all the FRC boxes. But I'm going to say, listen, this is how we know we're making a difference. And actually, it's quite hard. We talked about that this morning about metrics, but you can't just rely on metrics. I mean, you've got to challenge, you've got to ask yourself. And when we wrote the report, it was throwing up issues like, actually, that didn't go too well. And I had to confront, do I put that in there? And as the Environmental Pension Fund, if I get it wrong, I know I'm going to be in the press. And I was giving them some open goals. Now, actually, they didn't turn out to become open goals. It wasn't quoted, I don't think, anywhere. But I think that reporting is about being honest in terms of, listen, we tried this and it didn't work. Now, the following year, I was looking for all these examples of where things had worked and hadn't worked. And we had a meeting with a particular asset manager and they said, we did this, you know, and actually that didn't work. And I said, fantastic. Could you give me that? I'll put that in my code for next year. And they said, oh, well, it never made it into our code because we never got an approved case study from them. But I think, you know, I think that's important too in terms of fleshing out what works and what doesn't work. And then the final thing I'll say is going back to the members. So my stewardship code is long, it's 60 pages, and it's 60 pages because we want to put in shed loads of case studies, shed loads of examples of where it goes right, where it goes wrong, right across the board, not just in terms of, you know, the stewardship element, but the holistic approach to RI. And actually what we're looking at now is actually taking that, summarising it within 2 pages and saying, listen, these are the highlights, go and read the full report. Because actually what I was disappointed by is that I gave my members all that information and actually, you know, not as many people read it as I thought they would. So what a PR expert said, listen, who's going to read a 60-page report? Give them 2 pages. So that's what we're going to try this year. Summarise it into 2 pages and then say, listen, what do you think? Give us your feedback. Okay, thank you. I should have.
Thanks very much. My name's Hans Hirt. Until recently, I was part of an asset manager, but currently probably one of my exciting roles is with an asset owner. So I'm a trustee director of a small pension fund, which is very, very rewarding, interesting to see it from the other side. I also write a piece at the moment on stewardship, so looking back at the last 18 years, being in the industry and being one of the first probably professionals in stewardship, sort of full-time engaged. And some of the comments really resonated with me around complexity, because I remember in 2004, I joined an activist fund at Hermes. And the task was very clear at the time. It's about alpha generation. We look at 1 year, we look at 2 years, 3 years. We have a target price, but we didn't worry about the environment or systemic risk. It was all about outperformance in that particular fund. Think about it now, and I'm looking around at stewardship colleagues who are still doing this. It's hugely complex, and I think that was nicely summarized in the earlier discussions. Also, I think Dan's comments resonated with me. Sort of as a German, I remember working with Volkswagen very early on, and that's just different from, it's not the BP or Shell or Barclays. It's just that you engaged with the other shareholders, and that's something I think we didn't get right with corporate governance codes, and we make the same mistake with stewardship codes. I need to confess that I was part of the working group in Singapore who installed the code. So apologies if you created a monster in Singapore, but I'd like to focus on my comments today on the UK. And I think we also need to realize where we are and be a little bit more humble. And I think the Kingman review, normally the British reviews in my experience are very nicely worded, but he concluded the stewardship code is ineffective and creates boilerplate reporting, and that's not a long time ago. It's a couple of years ago, and I think we have made progress. The new code, I think, is fantastic. We heard about it from the FRC, but there is still so much work to be done. So what I wanted to do very quickly in my 5 minutes, probably already well into it, but just taking stock, and then looking. I defined 5 questions I would ask an asset manager if I were an asset owner, so to get a little bit under the hood of what's actually happening. So first conclusion, has the stewardship code, new code, has it made an impact? And I think it's fair to say there's much more talk about ESG and stewardship. There's an increasing resource in the industry, and we at Hermes have always been at the wrong end, because all the funds like to come to Hermes and just take the best people out, and then they land somewhere else. So that was very particular in the last couple of years, very apparent. And it's just professionalized. I remember arriving at Hermes in 2004. I had no idea what I was doing about stewardship. There was no one really to look at how are we doing this and what are systematic approaches. Now there are training programs for stewardship professionals. Also, a lot of activity is going on and a lot of reporting. We heard about the stewardship report. I think the Hermes one runs to 90 pages, and it's really interesting reading. I have taken the time over the Christmas holidays to review quite a large number of reports. So it's good reading, but it's mainly still quantity rather than quality of engagement. And I think the particular example is about outcomes. When you think about outcomes, very few asset managers actually trying to measure in any systematic ways. And we heard about the anecdotes. Yes, there are lots of anecdotes in the reports, but could one not try to more systematically measure how are stewardship insights used in the investment process, just as one example. And then there's almost no talk about what is the contribution of a specific asset manager. And too often you see 1,000 engagements with 1,000 companies and 1,000 interactions, which basically means sort of one, maybe there was a phone call, but I think for my 18 years, nothing happens if you call a company in Asia and sort of mention climate change in passing. I think there is still a lot of engagement washing, very poor quality engagement ongoing. I think we just need to be honest about this. This becomes particularly clear in Principle 4, which is about systemic risk, which I think we heard about, which is very flimsy and not at all clear what is being done. And also if there's a mandate from asset owners to do that, but equally in Principle 7, which is about investment integration, and we heard about there just seem to be different worlds, the investment team, and then there's the ESG team. But how does it matter for investment decisions? There are very, very few good examples. So I come to my five questions for asset management. The first one is really about what is the purpose? What are you trying to achieve as an asset manager? And I started with my experience with an activist fund. One objective is just outperformance, just creating alpha 1, 2, 3 years, and that's very legitimate. But if that is your objective, then just say it, because it isn't compatible with addressing the big systemic risk in every case. There's some overlap, but it's not the same. So second category, second objective is addressing the systemic risk, which matter for the asset owners of the world, because market returns in 10, 20, 30 years are more important for a pension fund than alpha in the short term. So that's the second one. Third category I would call is about norms and values, where sometimes they can contribute to outperformance, but very often it isn't about financial materiality. It is about our values and norms. And I think just starting being honest about, here are 3 different categories. Yes, there's overlap, but what is your primary objective as an asset manager? And also acknowledging, yes, there will be trade-offs. We heard from Marco this morning about the Moderna vote, but it's equally true about climate engagement. There comes a point in time where what you ask in the company isn't in the interest of the company or a short-term focused investor. Second point, I speed up, and this links to clients. How do you ensure that the objectives you set as an asset manager, that they align with the interest of the asset owners, which are very well represented here? It's because of the trade-offs I mentioned. This is increasingly important. If you think if what you're doing is about outperformance alpha, that's a very different proposition from systemic risk. And of course, it matters also for the commercial model of asset managers. You can benefit as an asset manager from creating alpha outperformance short term, but addressing systemic risk is a free good, and no one is particularly interested in paying paying for that. Third point, capability and limitations. Very few asset managers are fully sort of staffed to do stewardship properly around the world, and that hasn't changed very much. And it's not just about bodies, but it's also about expertise. If you're addressing climate change, if you're addressing biodiversity, if you're addressing antimicrobial resistance, it's not someone who has been in fund management previously, and you need very significant and senior resource to do that properly. And if it is about alpha and outperformance, then stewardship is much better done together, very closely aligned with in investment teams. There are limitations of corporate engagement, one-on-one engagement, most beautifully articulated in a recent report of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance on future of investor engagement. That just some topics you can only get so far with corporate engagement. I think that's a simple story. And if you look at net zero pledges also of asset managers, very often it's all about engagement and so suggesting that is the solution. I think sensibly there's a lot of work in the value chain, but there's also a lot of work on the policy side. Two more points. For what I would call causation, and can you actually as an asset manager demonstrate somehow that your work has contributed to an outcome? And that's quite fundamental. You will not often have a shareholder resolution where you can say 100%. It's our work. It would not have happened without us. But there are in between stages where you can document. We raised an issue first 5 years ago. 4 years ago, we made a proposal. We talked to the company 2 or 3 times a year. We talk to the chair, we talk to all other relevant stakeholders, and that just doesn't come through. Most of the anecdotal evidence isn't particularly convincing. And last but not least, and that links to the point about measurement, try a little bit harder on the measurement. That includes trying to work out what stewardship adds to investment performance of funds, but also includes try to estimate what are you changing on a systemic risk, and how much does it impact upon returns in the future. So I think final word, I think is ultimately back to the investment chain, and back we talked about the model mandates and Paul's visionary, unbelievably visionary work in 2012, and the ICGN's work on sort of relaunching that piece of work. It's all about the investment chain, having more transparency, better reporting, and better accountability in the investment chain. Sorry, that was definitely more than 5 minutes.
We're on time, so now we will start with discussion among ourselves, and then we will move on to Q&A. So as an academic, I cannot resist bringing up one study. So we will now talk about the conflict between divesting and engaging and accountability on that front. So there is a recent paper by Jonathan Burke and Jules van Binsbergen from 2022 that actually addresses to some extent this question. So let us take a small thought experiment. So we say, let's for now assume we will avoid some companies completely, okay? And the theory would predict that their cost of capital would go up. And at some point, if really nobody invested in this company, it would be so high that they would be, in a hypothetical world, driven out of business. Now, there is a theory paper that actually shows that even under the most optimistic scenarios, this is not going to happen. So there would have to be more than 80% ESG investors just to push the cost of capital just a tiny bit up. So actually, the authors of the paper suggest to socially conscious investors not to walk away, but actually to invest and engage. And this leads us to a question to my panelists. As what do you see as the currently most effective form of engagement? So let's say abstracting from, well, not walking away. And if you witness engagement of insufficient quality, what are the steps you take? And lastly, do you see more accountability on this front in recent years? So anyone who would like to answer? Maybe Jane?
Thanks. Yeah, we're a big believer in engagement over divestment. I mean, we represent, like I said, 11 different LGPS funds who've all got slightly different views. And what we do at Border to Coast is bring everybody together so we can really use that weight of assets that we've got to impact and affect change. I think the most influential type of engagement, and even though I've said how big we are as an asset owner, individual holdings will still be quite small. So trying to engage individually is not as effective as working in collaboration. So we are part of initiatives such as Climate Action 100 Plus, working with other asset owners on issues such as cybersecurity, where we're working with ALAM and a number of asset owners on cybersecurity. And then through PRI, through the Local Authority Pension Fund Forum, which represents all the local government pension schemes. But also because we have assets, global assets, and we can engage directly with, especially with UK companies, because we've got an internal team. We've got quite close relationships with a number of companies, so we can engage directly there. But when it comes to emerging markets, Asia Pacific, it's much more difficult for us to be able to do that. So we've got an external engagement provider in Robeco that engages on our behalf alongside a number of other clients that it's working on behalf of. A bit like when Hans was at Hermes EOS, it's that same type of relationship that we've got there. I think engagement. I know we've talked about the different definitions. I know Hans has talked about different definitions to a degree on engagement, and we see this with examples that our external managers are providing that I'm very dubious about the quality of some of that engagement. And if it is engagement, it's actually discovery, and it's about it's a type of meetings and analysis that you do before you buy a stock, before you buy an issuer. It's analysis. It's all that due diligence that you should be doing before you invest in anything. So we're still getting examples of that thrown into the mix, as that's them engaging with companies, which we really push back against. There's also the engagement when it's around a results season and portfolio managers that are meeting with companies. Again, that's not engagement. That's just meeting the company to understand where they are in the business strategy, and throwing in an ESG question or asking them about the climate change strategy. I'm sorry, that's not engagement. Engagement is when you've identified a particular issue that you know that you can work with that company, with other investors to impact and affect change. That doesn't mean to say that at some point you shouldn't escalate. And we've got a very clear escalation strategy. So it's engage, collaborative engagement, vote. So whether that's against the directors, against the chair, against the reporting accounts, against the remuneration policy, there are a number of different ways that you can demonstrate that you're not happy. But to be able to do that, and to be able to do that properly, you need to articulate that to the company. Otherwise, it's a wasted vote. But it is very time consuming, and we are getting better at that. We've got a very small team. We're looking to recruit. So if anybody knows anybody that wants to work in Leeds and remotely as well, I think there's a job being advertised today. But that's really important that we articulate to a company what we're doing. And that has led to some very good conversations over the last couple of years. Well, whilst we've only been in operation for 4 years, but we get companies that are approaching us about their remuneration policies. They're approaching us ahead of peak voting season on climate strategies. So we've had calls with BP and Shell recently on that. So you need to be telling them why. And you know, we voted against BP, we voted against Shell, but we articulated to the company why. And we knew that they'd be disappointed, but we explained why we were voting against. But it's then, what do you do next? Shareholder resolutions, co-filing, making AGM statements. And then at some point when you've gone through all that journey, you've got that uncomfortable decision to make. Has it resulted in an impact on the investment case for that particular stock, that particular holding? If it has, and I hate this term divestment, because I'm an ex-portfolio manager, and I never used to say, oh, I've decided to divest from this holding. You decided to sell it because you didn't think the investment case was there anymore. And I think a lot of this is around making sure that you're thinking about, is the investment case there? Is there a reputational risk associated with this that's going to impact the bottom line? And if it is, then you reduce that holding or you decide to come out. And that happened. I can provide one instance of this happening a couple of years ago with Exxon. We held it in one of our internally managed funds. It was under engagement, and we couldn't see the company wasn't changing. But it wasn't just on climate change alone that we decided to come out. We decided to come out because that portfolio manager thought that the financial case wasn't there. The company come out with not particularly good results. I know things have changed over the last couple of years since we came out, but it was the RI team working with the portfolio managers as to why they decided to exit that stock. So they didn't say, I'm divesting from Exxon. They said, I've decided to sell the stock because I don't see that there's an investment case for holding it anymore. So I think those decisions will become more uncomfortable. I mean, I didn't mention earlier, we made a commitment to be net zero across our investment portfolios by 2050 or sooner, late last year. So we're in the process of working out our roadmap and looking at metrics and looking at setting targets against all those metrics. And part of that, a big part of getting us to net zero is not divesting from all those stocks to make your portfolios look a bit greener, because that doesn't have any impact in the real world. It's about engaging with those big emitters that we need to get us to a low carbon transition and low carbon economy. But so engagement is a critical part of our strategy to get to net zero. But there will be at some point that over the next few years where we might have to make that decision that we no longer want to be in those stocks because we don't believe that they can get there. So sorry, that was a bit long.
Thanks. And just to add to that, so I should have said up front, the Environmental Pension Fund is a local government pension scheme, and we're part of the Brunel Pension Partnership, so it's a different pool from which Jane is in. So I want to give another example from the world of mining. 2015, pre-pooling, we were involved in a portfolio, and it held BHP. BHP was involved with a mining disaster. Sadly, it's been involved in mining disasters since. In 2015, there were 19 people who were killed in this disaster. The company promised to do lots of things to rectify, you can't bring back people, but in terms of the local community and provide housing, etc. Meanwhile, in the fund, every 3 years we have a large investment strategy review. It's linked to understanding how well financed we are and which asset classes we need to be in. And over the course of 5 years, actually, we came out of that particular portfolio, so we no longer held this particular company. And then we found out actually that the company, and I think it was in the press, had not actually done what they said they would do. You know, the local people were still having a really tough time. There was no houses being built. And so we went back to the asset manager where we held it, and we said, listen, we held the stock through you. We're going to hold you accountable. What are you doing about it? And meanwhile, we're also part of the local authority pension forum, and they were looking at this issue more broadly around mining and what they could do about it. And they were also raising this as an issue, saying, listen, these communities have been really poorly served here by these mining giants. Now, also around the same time, Stephen's here in the room, Church of England were also starting a really fantastic mining initiative and looking at what are the global standards, these tailing dams, what are the standards that they should be meeting. Now, over the course of that review for our fund, we then ended up holding this company again through a different portfolio. And so what we did then is we shared all the information with them and said, listen, they're not doing what they should be doing. Can you raise this with them? So there was 2 asset managers in effect that we were, asking to raise issues around this with the company. And then in fact, the tailings dam, the mining standards, I can't remember the official term, Stephen, but in terms of this, the Church of England initiative was really successful. And very recently, the asset manager that we are holding it with currently came to us and said, actually, we're not going to hold this company anymore because part of the reason, part of their analysis was actually there's too many tailings dams at risk. So it's come out of our portfolio. So what we're left with is actually we've only got one way that we can directly influence, that old asset manager of ours. We're relying on them to go to that board and start, that company and start speaking to them. And to be honest with you, I don't know if that asset manager would give as much importance to us now that we're no longer a client. I don't know. That's a question for debate. So what we're left with is actually, the Local Authority Pension Forum actually has been really effective for us because they've been a partner and we keep saying to them, listen, this is an issue. And they've put, what they've done now is put on their website how many houses this company is building, and it's still really low. It's still not meeting it. So it's part of reputational risk in terms of this is a way that we can highlight this as an issue. So I think for me, that kind of threw up, actually, if you divest, we are engaged first, working with Brunel, looking at, okay, what point do you divest if the company's not changing? But, if divest, you take away some of that power that you have. I'm not saying that you should stay in there if the company's not changing. I'm just saying that this is complex in terms of understanding the performance of a particular company.
Thank you.
I think both Jane and Hans touched on it. I think it's about demonstrating the impact then of what your engagement is. So, listen, you go and spend 1,000 hours studying for an exam and, you put all the work in and you get 10%. That's not good enough. It's like, so I've had the 1,000 engagements and what came of it? And so I think that's where it is complex. And ultimately you might come to a stage where, listen, I don't want to hold this stock anymore. But before that, what are you trying to achieve and how fruitful or meaningful has the engagement been? I think from both sides of it, fall into a little bit of a trap of, the CEO and CFO will go out on their roadshows and they'll spend, X amount prepping and this is what we want to come across, this is what we want to talk about. I find, and my experience is when the chair goes out and meets the stewardship teams, the quality of conversation is far less, because maybe that's just from practice and established. But I think ultimately you win the engagement argument by being able to demonstrate case studies whereby you have changed a business's practice. That's, it. And then, the conversation stops. I think there probably is a role in terms of investment from putting pressure on in a different way. And I can't remember, I think it was one of the BEIS reports that sort of found that, actually investors are, worse at changing company practice than media or public pressure. And that's probably an uncomfortable place to be. And so maybe if you get into the FT and Norway is divested from XYZ, that kind of starts putting the pressure on a little bit in a different way. But before that, I think if you demonstrate the actual impact of the 1,000 meetings in a year or whatever it is, or the 18 months that you spend trying to change, and then if you do divest or sell the shares, you can bring wider and your asset owners through that whole process as well. And I think that's the double pressure of we tried really hard with this company and they weren't for changing. Or on the successful side, this is what we went through with the business and this was the outcome. I think that's where businesses should be trying to get to, is not efforts or policies or commitments, but actual impact and outcomes. And I think stewardship should be based on the same principles.
Just very briefly, because I agree with pretty much everything that's been said. I'm a big fan of engagement. I've spent 20 years plus doing it, but there is definitely a place for divestment. But just as Jane has said, just as on voting, it's actually the communication of the vote that is the powerful thing. The vote itself is almost meaningless. The conversation that goes around it, if there is a conversation, is actually the thing that delivers the chance of change. The publication of a process of divesting is the thing that gives you the chance to drive change through it. Just walking away, the Wall Street walk, is not enough. You've got to do so noisily. And also be open to buying back in should something appropriate change that makes you more comfortable. As everybody said, it's not just a numbers game. it is all about the quality of what's done in practice. All too often people are only focused on the numbers, and that does lead, as Hans says, to low quality activity that just drives up your numbers and doesn't deliver anything in practice. It's quite easy to get under the skin of that if you ask the right questions. Just actually pass the reporting a bit carefully, you can spot it, but you need to have the confidence to do that, to know the questions to ask, to understand where the gaps lie in the reporting. Just one anecdote on our activity. We were assisting a client in assessing its managers on their engagement activity. One of their managers had some fantastic stories about the issues that it had talked to companies about, and the thought process that was around the business drivers and their linkage to ESG was fabulous. But as I pointed out to the client, this was all Principle 7 type engagement, i.e. monitoring the activity that is closest to your investment decision making. And it clearly was driving their investment decision making, but it was not Principle 9 engagement for change, actually trying to deliver something different at the company. Once I pointed that out to the client, they said, "Oh yes, that's quite obvious, but it's only obvious when you see it and understand it." And then their decision was that form of engagement wasn't enough for them, and they are no longer using that manager. So it is possible to look through the raw numbers and really understand, but you need to have the confidence, the insight to do that.
Sorry, can I just go one? I forgot to say something. I think one thing that forgotten as well is kind of dispersed ownership, and there's probably music to, I think Andy Griffiths here is probably a role for collective engagement as well, and you're hearing it from more voices as opposed to, businesses go out and they hear from 10 investors and two said one thing, two said something in between, three said nothing, and three others were happy with it. So I think, trying to collectively engage with companies as well. So trying to curry support amongst fellow shareholders, there is literally sort of strength in numbers.
And maybe just a couple of sentences. One, I think, comes back to the question: what are you trying to achieve with divestment? Why are you doing it? And there's one, of course, you may do it because you're fundamentally against being an investor in fossil fuels, which is an important stance, and I think it has the public impact. It can also influence public policy work. So it's not just the media pressure on the company, but it can drive public policy. I think the academic evidence on affecting cost of capital is not particularly strong. So if you're trying to really drive or really put the company in a difficult spot, cut it off finance, and that is probably not really working. And then there's a third category where you just say the E risks are too big, and you're certainly reducing your positions in a portfolio. We talked about escalation. I think the escalation point is really important, that you try everything before you make the step. And the engine number one, I think, is where we started, or where we mentioned earlier. There's, I think, some people suggesting if there had been less divestment, then all four candidates would now be on the board, and engine number one nominated 4 and 3 got on the board. So it was a tight call, and I think it's a nice point in case if there had been earlier collective action and not divestment of some funds, maybe we would have been in an even better position on the board, but that's just an anecdote.
All right, so let us now move on to another paper. So I really cannot resist bringing up the paper. So there is one by Meyerowitz, P. and Ringenberg that actually looks at the trade-off between maximizing firm value and following other objectives. Okay, so because let's think of we would like to minimize pollution, but also we would like shareholder returns. And the good news is that it is possible to have these two goals at the same time. However, what the paper finds is that everything breaks down as soon as we start following too many goals. So two are possible. We can do shareholder value maximization and one thing, okay? But they theoretically prove that as soon as you have too many objectives that you follow, it leads to unstable corporate governance choices and also unstable choice of policies and so on and so forth. So at this point, I would like to bring up, for instance, the recent development by BlackRock that is preparing a platform to give the small shareholders a bigger voice, a greater voice in what happens with their funds and how are they voted. And also, we can also link it to the collective engagement. So I would say in the future, we might be seeing, stronger collaboration, but then potentially there might be more noise coming from smaller shareholders voting in different on different belief systems. So what's your opinion on this? How do you see future collective engagement? Is it going to be on a country level that the UK pension funds will team up with UK pension funds, or will they team up with the US ones too? And how to agree on this one objective, because so my research is in ESG. There are more like 650 metrics that you can be optimizing. So this development somehow worries me. So please share your thoughts on this.
Okay, I'll give it a go. So yes, there is a danger of a Tower of Babel, and I feel sorry for companies a lot of the time, because they're getting this huge range of views coming at them, and it's far too infrequently corralled into a single message and real clarity. And that's, I mean, Andy is here from the Investor Forum. That's actually the core skill, I think, of the Investor Forum, is corralling everybody into a similar space and communicating with clarity. And that is why the forum has been so very successful in what it's done. The problem is that investment institutions are only willing to come together in the worst cases, in the most problematic situations. Everybody kind of likes to do their own thing for as long as they're able to, and it's only when almost disaster has struck that they feel that they want to collaborate in that way, and therefore sometimes value has already been lost, and that's very unfortunate. But I do think there is clearly a truth that if you can focus down and come with clarity, then you can drive real value. I mean, the conversations that I used to have with company chairs, they were always grateful for the starting point of those conversations being the business and the business model, the strategy, and only then you talk about the ES or G issue or issues that you want to talk about. But by placing them within that business context, you both you position yourself as being an investor proper, but you also position the dialogue around how these issues affect the business. And that does provide a really important discipline for you in targeting the conversation on the issues that really matter as well. Anybody? Go on.
Yeah, I think there is that issue, isn't there, that as more and more asset owners, asset managers engage, because not that they're forced into it, but because it's the right thing to do, and it's part of the UK Stewardship Code requirements. It's about demonstrating your effectiveness as a steward of the assets that you've got under management. But like Paul says, it's making sure that then companies aren't overwhelmed. overwhelmed by the amount of reporting that they're having to do, then overwhelmed by the number of asset owners, asset managers and stakeholders that are wanting to engage on similar but not quite the same grounds. So it's about making sure that it's effective and it's constructive. I know there are challenges around collaborative engagement. When you're getting a number of investors together to agree the same aims and objectives, it can be challenging, but it's really important that you get that right at the start, and you then set those clear aims and milestones and what you're looking to, the objective of that engagement is, because it's about having that clarity of purpose when you're speaking to a company, so that they know what you're asking them and they know what steps that you'd like them to take. It's more about being like a critical friend. I think that's the way we'd kind of see it, that you're not wanting to beat the company up all the time, although there are some instances where you need to do that. It's getting that constructive engagement and that relationship with those companies, because you're not going to be engaging with them on a short-term basis. There might be the odd instance where an engagement might be relatively short and you get a company to change its behaviour quite relatively quickly, but it tends to be 3+ years, which can be frustrating for lobbying organisations and stakeholders that want to see change quickly, and that's not going to happen, especially when you're talking about engaging on climate risk and opportunities. That will be a much more longer engagement. But yeah, it's about making sure that you've got everything set up right, that you've got the aims, your objectives, and you're working constructively together, and you've got the governance as well for that collaborative engagement project in place.
I think we need to move to Q&A. So are there questions in the audience, please?
Thank you very much. I'm Alexandra Yordanovska. I'm a senior lecturer at Hirt King's at the School of Law. Thank you very much for the interesting talks. I have 2 questions. I was wondering, in terms of deciding how to engage with particularly fossil fuel companies, what is the information that stewards use to feed into that level of engagement? And should it, for example, a fossil fuel company reluctance to stop exploring new fossil fuels be sort of the bottom line of disinvestment by default? Should that be something that should form part of, some kind of industry standards? And the second question is, in terms of talking about stewardship accountability, I think I'm referring to something that Paul mentioned about other stakeholders. To what extent reputational risk is important? And for example, speaking about recently XR disrupting the Shell AGM, potential litigation as well in court. I was wondering how those other types of governance are important. Thank you.
Would you care if you answer, and then we move on to the next? Okay, let's move on.
Okay.
I have a question which I think is really for Peter. As an ex-lawyer, he'll recognise this, I think. It flows from his remark that there are often people on the board discouraging the board from disclosing information, wanting to reduce the amount of information the company puts out into the public domain. And I've been looking at some cases recently in which parent companies have been sued by the victims of unlawful action by subsidiaries, the subsidiaries generally being based in a foreign country. And in order to make these claims stand up, what the claimants have to show is that the parent took control of the relevant aspect of the subsidiary's activities which generated the harm. Managerial control, not just ownership control. Okay, and this is a difficult task for claimants to discharge. Sometimes they can find a whistleblower, but what they rely on above all is the statements that companies have put out in the public domain, normally on their websites, saying how great they are about controlling all these risks around the globe. So I have a sort of two-part question. One is this a tension between disclosure and litigation risk that you recognise at board level? And perhaps more important, do you see the risk of litigation as a positive step in the ESG process?
Hi, my name's Ewan McGaffey from King's College London with Deanies here in Alexandra. And thank you to everyone on the panel. Really interesting. This is a question mainly, I think, for Marion and for Jane. I wanted to press the point about divestment over engagement. We just had somebody called Caroline Dennett resign from Shell, saying that all the stuff that we do at Shell about environmental responsibility, it's all nonsense. We're saying one thing, but actually we're doing another. So, wouldn't that lead us to conclude that with companies like Shell, which I noticed pops up in the EAPF annual report as a good example of where we've engaged. I mean, doesn't it lead us to think that actually engagement isn't working at all with certain fossil fuel companies, and that we should just divest, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because there's a risk of significant financial detriment from fossil fuels. Now, that's the test from the Supreme Court in a case called Palestine Solidarity in 2020. We can invest in whatever we want, so long as there's not a risk of significant financial detriment. And of course, there's huge risk from fossil fuels. Even if they make profits like now, then there's a windfall tax. And there's been the lowest returns in 10 years compared to any other energy sector, Imperial College Business School report. And then you've got what your members want. I mean, obviously at EAPF, everyone wants you to divest. And I also looked up what the Border to Coast Council's members want. And 4 of the councils have declared a climate emergency. So shouldn't you be, just following what the members want? And also, isn't that the right thing now to do financially? So, don't bother with engagement anymore. Just get out of Shell.
Hi, I'm Michelle Cardwell. I'm a project manager at the Financial Reporting Council, and right now we've been doing some interesting work on ESG and net zero reporting. And so I think it would be really great to touch a bit about the tools that you have for accountability and engagement, which is corporate reporting. I'd love to hear about sufficiency of current reporting, in particular on both sides of engagement, but perhaps also in planning out your own net zero goals, as both Jane and Marion have mentioned that as asset owners you guys have been working towards. Thanks.
Yeah. Great. So I think most of the questions are too difficult for me, the legal ones. I pass on. So I start with this relatively straightforward one, which I think was your one, which I translate is you asked effectively how far to push companies. And is there an alignment? That's exactly the point I was making. You will get a very different opinion from a fund manager who is invested in BP. How far do you push them down the decarbonization trajectory relative to someone who comes from an asset owner perspective thinking about systemic risk, market returns, 20, 30 years, where should the company be going? And so I think there's a big disconnect, and we need more clarity around this. Also comes back to the question, should asset managers not do what their beneficiaries, what the asset owner beneficiaries say? Ultimately, it's their money that they can decide and give instructions. And maybe just one word on Paul's question. I think it has a really useful role, litigation to play on the ESG journey of companies. The liability of directors, I think, hits really home. You see already with some of the cases at Shell that it has an impact on their thinking. I think there will be a clash at some point between fiduciary duties of trustees and asset owners and fiduciary duties of corporate boards, which may sort of suggest different things at different points in time. But I'm handing over to a proper lawyer.
Far from, and I hope none of my clients or prospects are watching. But absolutely, I think every tool in the box should be considered, and it's probably an escalation, and maybe it starts with engagement, moves to divestment, and ends up in litigation, and that's just a rough guide. But I would say that gets to the heart of I suppose the title of the panel is, these are the statements that companies have put out and now they're being held to account for them. And what we try to push is go and say it, but you have to actually do it as well. So it's like, this is going to make you accountable, and more accountable directors make for better business. It doesn't feel like that sometimes when you're explaining that to them, and it feels like an additional risk I don't need. But in the long term, it will be the betterment of your stakeholders and the efficacy of the business. And that's the role of reporting, is to explain to the wider world how I suppose we've got to a place where how you're protecting and improving the interests of all of the stakeholders of a business. And if you fail those stakeholders, then yeah, you should be held to account. You're hoping that by spurring a level of accountability, you won't get to that stage, because you'll avoid incidents like these, because there will be proper oversight of subsidiaries, because you put out these statements, these glowing statements about how brilliant you were. And I think that's just the second point is it's not even the don't disclose something, but it's the dilution of the disclosure. And so say it in a different way, that sort of, we always we go to clients and say, listen, if you say something that isn't glossy and self-aggrandizing, it's good disclosure. I always, from a glasshouse perspective, it's like you go through 350 annual reports, and the one that said we actually did something wrong this year was like, oh yeah, they're probably actually discussing the issues at the board. Whereas all of the other ones are, despite massive headwinds and all the challenges, we've we've gone past our expectations, which were incredibly low. So I think that's where it's the efficacy and the tangibleness of the disclosure, and they're all linked. And so should you be making commitments not to keep going into the ground? If you do, then you'll have to be held to account to them, or else receive litigation. And it's the same. I think it's all linked in terms of reporting and accountability. Push people to act, and then stand over their actions in detail to the wider world. Yeah.
I'll also attempt to answer Paul's question, but slightly tangentially. And Paul always asked the toughest questions when I was his student, so I'm well used to it. So interestingly, the tailings dam disaster that Marion talked about in Brazil wasn't run by BHP. The company that ran that mine was an independent company that happened to be a joint venture between BHP and Vale. I had engaged with BHP for multiple years about their 3 uncontrolled joint ventures, or non-controlled joint ventures. Joint ventures are really common in the exploration sector. Companies regularly get together to sort of share the risk, but typically one of those companies is the lead on that, and those are controlled joint ventures. Where that is not the case, no one company takes the lead, you've got a risk, because who's setting the standards? How is it controlled? What is the governance structure? And as I say, BHP had 3 of those, one of which managed its tailings dam so badly that it killed a couple of dozen people. And that, I think, is a really fascinating window into why control matters and how wrong it can be got. I believe that BHP has now exited one of those 3, but I think it still is involved in 2, which I think is an unfortunate thing. I'll also just try and answer the question about the quality of disclosure and reporting. Frankly, it's not good enough. There's all sorts of gaps, and the particular concern that I have is the disconnect that there is between the financials and the narrative reporting. I worked on a project called the Climate Accounting Project shortly before joining Redington, and we looked at company accounts, and basically there was no connection between the assumptions that are in the financials about the investments that they've made, the life of those assets and so on, and what they were saying and thinking about climate. And that's clearly a huge problem. Interestingly enough, this week we've talked about Exxon's AGM last year. Exxon's AGM this year, I think there was an even more powerful vote, potentially, which was 52% of shareholders saying, could you please join up the assumptions in your financials with what you're saying about climate? And if that call is heard by Exxon or by the market generally, actually something will shift. But until that shifts, I think it's very hard to believe what is said in a lot of the narrative reporting.
Great. Let's keep going to Jane and Marion.
Yeah.
And then
Okay. Really glad somebody's actually reading our report. So thank you for doing your homework. Yes. I think it's 2018. Our chair was involved in some work with Shell around a shareholder event. And I think actually a year or two ago, I think Shell were probably the darling as seen as the leader in the RO in terms of from asset owners, in terms of actually of all these oil and gas companies, these are the ones that are trying to make their, trying to do something about that. I think that has been discredited since. To give you the context, so I mentioned before about we went on this journey. We moved quite a lot from passive into active, sustainable equity. So when my members ask me about my oil and gas exposure, our oil and gas exposure, I said actually it's really, really low. And it is really low because all those active equities just didn't invest in oil and gas companies. We held some passive for risk return, cost reasons. And actually Shell was popping up in our, I think it was low carbon, which sounds really bonkers that they should be in a low carbon portfolio, but that's what it was. And in fact, we no longer hold it. Since then, we are now in a Paris aligned, through Brunel, in a Paris aligned passive portfolio, which is tilted, which includes TPI data, so it looks kind of forward looking, which are the companies. And actually Shell's gone out, but Total is still in there. And I know it's one. And when we had a meeting with members last year, we discussed this. And I said, listen, what we're trying to do through this engagement is get these companies to change. I think there is a strong argument there that actually to really move to a low carbon economy globally, you're going to have to need these oil and gas companies to change. We're still going to be using oil and gas, even if you look at IEA data for 2050, it's still going to be there. We need these companies to change. So what we want to do is we hold them in these Paris aligned portfolios, and actually if they're making their way in, doing that, they can come back into the portfolio. So I wanted that to be clear. Now then, so look at the TPI data. Actually, Total is, I think if I recall correctly, it's not 1.5, it's below 2, I think, for 2050. Off the top of my head. Now listen, you're probably saying to me, that's not enough. I want them to change more. It's a really complex argument. That's how, so I mentioned about this wider context. We've got 84 times amount more invested in renewables than we have in these 3 or 4 oil and gas companies that are still in our portfolio. But it's the thing that really bothers my members. As a committee, we had a meeting back in end of last year where we looked at this exposure to oil and gas. Do we just come out and say, don't want anything to do with oil and gas? This argument around, listen, we need whole economy changes here. We could walk away tomorrow. It'd be really easy for the Right Pension Fund to make a case to say, we don't want anything to do with this, we're walking away. But who's going to buy those shares if we just walk away? Now, I know you're going to say to me, well, listen, you've done that for the rest of your portfolio. Why are you doing that in this little bit of the portfolio? But we're saying, listen, this is in our Paris aligned portfolio, and the metrics, and I appreciate there's data issues here, broadly saying that actually of all the oil and gas companies, this one is doing a bit better. So listen, you're not the first person to ask me that. My members ask me that at every meeting. We do a lot with our members, and this thing comes up over and over again. But last year, for the first time, I said, listen, they're in our Paris aligned portfolio. And we make it all very transparent. We're with Tumalo, our information, anybody's out there to see in terms of what we invest in. So, yeah, they're going to have to hold me to account to say, listen, actually, is Total really doing what they're supposed to be doing? So, yeah, it's a tricky one. I appreciate it's a tricky one, and we kind of straddle both arguments because on one hand, we've got very little, but on the other hand, we haven't walked away completely.
Yeah, can I just try and answer your question, because you asked the first question. I don't think anybody's answered it yet. I think the things that we're looking at as an investor, and thanks to the net task force on, remind me the name, that's looking at net zero transition. Yeah. I think we're really looking forward to the output of that, because it is really challenging for investors to assess what companies are doing, and that can be because of disclosure is not great enough, but it's also because disclosure is very different as to what companies are doing. I think Climate Action 100 Plus Net Zero benchmark and the indicators that they use are a really useful tool for investors. So looking at whether a company set short-term, medium, long-term goals on greenhouse gas emission reductions, looking at what they're doing on lobbying and lobbying against climate change with regulators and with industry associations that they're part of. Also, what are they doing on a just transition? I come from the north of England, an area that was decimated by the closure of coal mines and then hasn't recovered since, and that's 40 years ago. So what I'm really passionate about is making sure that when companies, whether that's a Shell or BP or a mining company or a utility, is changing its strategy and needs to relocate or make people redundant, that there's something there in place to support, because those jobs then have gone forever, and you need to also support those communities. Also about capital expenditure, and I think this is a real key as to what companies are doing, whether Shell, what's it doing on its capex spend, is that going into renewables, making sure that they not just oil and gas stocks, but the banks aren't putting more money into new drilling opportunities, new oil wells, etc., because we know that takes a number of years for those to get operational, and then does that become a stranded asset? What are they doing on technologies? Are they trying to pull the wool over our eyes by saying that they're going to do it by CCS, or they're going to do it by nature-based solutions? And these are some of the challenges that we posed to Shell last year. I think the other thing that you asked is about reputational risk, obviously.
We ran out of time. I'm so sorry.
Right, sorry.
I think
can I answer your question outside?